too far.
So first up, we'll go through this agenda and then I'll also send it in the chat. And again, I'll be monitoring the chat to answer questions you may have throughout the presentation, and then as well as when Jessica is presenting. She's continuing nonprofit in the Texas Panhandle workshop introduction she started last month. So we're going to learn a little bit more about that after we do a group connection activity, get to know each other a bit better. We'll go through some calendar updates, service reminders, and then at the end, we'll do another end of meeting survey so we can verify hours, so we can kind of keep track of attendance, and so you could log this as service time.
And I'm going to go ahead and jump in just to a look behind the curtain at some of what we're asking you guys to do. Like for instance, for this meeting for logging hours, and if there's other things you're doing remotely or teleservice, we'll follow up with more information, but we are kind of looking at different ways to verify those
Meeting.
because we want to be sure we're ready if we're ever
Right.
audited.
Okay, group
Things
connection.
happen with the Office of the Inspector General. All right. So I'm going to show a slide. Nope, I keep going over it. This is the general thing you'll see here is this is the progression of group development, and someone has also applied it to AmeriCorps group development. And you can see anytime you take something new or joining in with a new thing, this can be applicable. We know there's times where there's coming into a group, there's usually excitement and anticipation, maybe a little anxiety and optimism in that whole time of life. Then the creators of this study called it storming, when reality sets in and there may be frustration with the group you're in, the activities you're taking part in, or what you're doing. Hopefully then that moves to norming, where you kind of come to a point where there's shared goals, there's cohesion in the team, there's new coping with what the challenges are, coping skills to deal with whatever is being asked of you, and acceptance of, hey, this is how it is. This is what this group does. And from there, it's a building point that, like, hopefully there's kind of an updraft and some great work around teamwork, cohesiveness. That's the point where leadership really comes into play, and usually there's a higher level of performance for that group. Then there's times when the group is in our particular cycle, we have a end point. We have people who will be leaving the program. We have end dates for service. So then that comes to adjourning. That may involve, I don't know that you guys would ever have separation anxiety at leaving us, but depending on if there were, if there were some pivotal performance, what am I trying to say? Professional development skills gained, or like some good support that you've had, there might be some anxiety of leaving that. Crisis of figuring out what's next. There may be some points where it's like, hey, now I'm kind of mad at y'all, and there's some dissatisfaction about how the group went. And then next steps. I want to show this to y'all for a couple of reasons. One, to say we know there's points of working in AmeriCorps or joining any group, but this is about AmeriCorps, that are frustrating. And I've heard it from many people, and I recognize it, and we see it, and I get that. But hopefully we want to move to those points of establishing shared goals, growing in teamwork, kind of really building into what we can offer our community, our service site, the work we're doing has added value because you're part of a group. So this is something that's really interesting. I'm going to put this image into, if I do it right, it'll be on the screen while we break out into your group. And I want each of you to kind of think about, where are you falling on this curve? What's true for you? I recognize it may be that you may be at a point of kind of some frustration, or kind of some, hey, this is not all positive. But the question we have to address in the group is kind of more like, what's exciting to you, or what are you looking forward to? So we'd rather kind of focus in on some of that positivity about what's next. But let this be something that kind of shapes the group time that we're about to break out into. Before we just rush on ahead, does anyone have questions about this? All right. Also, and we'll get to this later, but I'm happy to share with you where this came from, and there's some more information around it, around like, okay, if you're in this forming stage, here's information for members, and it also has here's information for staff, and here's things you need to know. So we've got more developed around this, but this is kind of our first look at it. Um, I'm realizing I cannot share both the curve and the questions at the same time. Sophia, will you stick the questions into the chat?
Yes, I have.
And then I will show the curve. So when you get into the group, do a quick little round table.
Laura,
Yes.
do you mind the last one? It was forming, storming, norming, performing, adjusting, next steps. Okay, that's good. Thank you.
Yep. Adjourning, because that somehow fits better than adjusting. We've all got the
Oh,
take a minute to see who's the person traveling the farthest for upcoming holidays. Then you're going to tell the group, again, always say, where you are and where you serve, where you are in that curve, and what's energizing to you about serving with AmeriCorps. And, it's very fair to say where I am is I'm feeling a little bit of frustration. And we recognize that. But, what's energizing, or what are you kind of looking forward to? And then again, if there's any more time, because we'll take about 12 minutes, learn more about the others in your group. Think about what you learn about what people are doing, what they have going on, if you have questions about what their service is like or what they're learning. And then, talk about plans for the next 2 weeks.
I apologize if you see a white blur or ears occasionally. Finn has zero boundaries, so he's just become part of the meetings at this point. But did want to go over a couple things. So first thing is a service project that we actually have. It was earlier today, and I see a lot of faces from this morning, so long time no see. We did the setup for Another Chance House. They're doing a Home for Christmas service project. But it spans over 2 days. So if you weren't able to make it today and you still want to do a service project, this one's available tomorrow from 2 to 7 is what we're asking for. I know some people might need to leave early. That's understandable. But if you can get there around 2, that's about an hour before it starts. They can get everybody assigned to their spots. I thought it was really great. I didn't realize how much Another Chance House owned, like how many buildings they actually have. So it was really, really great to see that. Highly recommend. Um, December 24th through January 1st, all staff, like AmeriCorps staff, will be out of the office per WT policy. They give us that entire week off. I do want to plug in here real quick. I will personally be out from the 17th until the 1st. So if you try and reach out to me, I will have automatic email set up, but if you need anything, Sophia and Laura are kind of going to be my backup during that time before the 24th. And then January 3rd, we don't have a meeting. These meetings are normally monthly. We have some things scheduled like this every month, but we're not going to do one on the 3rd.
And I would say on that, when WT is closed, if there's something you need to reach out about, you know how to get a hold of us. You can, I won't be checking emails really often, but Teams is on my phone. Many of you have my phone number. If you need my phone number before December 24th, let me know. We are around, we are available, but I hope everyone is having a good chance to take a break. Nope, did I skip one? There we go.
Yep. Okay. So these are just some program updates. So the biggest one that I really want to emphasize is that starting January 1st, so starting the first of the year, we will be exclusively communicating through staff emails. Unless you have either already spoken to me, or if there's an issue that comes up. If there's an IT issue, we do want to try to work to resolve it. But one issue, for example, that we're running into is if you're a student, you have both a student and a staff email, and for some reason that causes a problem. So we're making some exceptions, but generally we're working to get everybody's staff email set up. If you need me to physically come to your site and help with that process, I'm more than happy to do that. Sometimes, like working through some of those issues, it helps to have multiple people involved in it. So reach out to me, let me know if you need any help with that. Spring service projects, MLK Service Day project will be required. Okay, that's one of the three, you're required to do three. This is one that is required. The tentative date is for the 25th, but from an email I've seen, I don't think it will actually be the 25th. I think we'll have to shift it around a little bit, so just be aware of that. We'll send out some more details, either within the next week or so, or it'll be after the holidays. Other service projects are going to be announced kind of as they come up. Ogallala Life at Wildcat Bluff, Wild West Wildlife Rehab Center. I always have to work to say that one. Is another one, and we're actually talking with the place as well about potentially doing a service project there. So a lot of opportunities to get to go to other people's sites, get involved a little bit more. It'll be great. Additional hours opportunities. I know I actually just talked about this in my group because it kind of came up. So one, we want you checking your benchmark. This is in your position description within America Learns. Your benchmark will tell you how many hours you should have for, we're in the middle of a timesheet, so I'd say go off of November 30th. So through the end of November. I've already reached out if I have questions or anything like that, but we're also going to be sending out, hopefully in the next week, a menu of items that you can choose from, kind of a packet. If you want to catch up on hours, want to get ahead a little bit, maybe to plan for, a sick day, because we can't plan when we get sick, or if your service site's closed over the holidays, this kind of packet will allow you to do some things via teleservices, so you'll be able to do them at home to get some hours. We do have that capped, but it ranges anywhere from like career services to those who might be interested in going to grad school, maybe helping you think through some of that. I think FAFSA is one of those, something for a blog that Sophia is working on. So a lot of different opportunities, and you really get to pick and choose which of those activities that you do, right? So we're not going to say you have to do all of them, but we want you to be able to pick what's applicable to you and what you feel like would help you most. We have reopened Teams, like Microsoft Teams, for members who want to connect. So feel free to use that. If you do log in, it'll be your same login as staff email. So it should be your same credentials for it as well. If you want to be part of that Teams, shoot a message in the chat so Sophia and I can see it, and we can get you added to some things if needed. Any questions about any of that right now?
I wanted to add something about the Teams. We're not going to use that. It's not required. As Hannah said, it's optional. We're not going to be putting in service reminders or anything like that. It's going to be largely member operated, member driven, where you guys can just socialize with each other, connect with each other. I have a couple of channels in there that are started for job opportunities, good news, and then just general chatter. So that really was up to you guys to use how you want.
I have a question, Hannah.
Yeah.
I see on here that the tentative date for MLK Service Day is the 25th. That's a Saturday. The MLK Day is the 20th.
Yeah, so it's when we say like MLK Day, it's really just around that time because we have to work with the service site to see what works for them. Originally, we had said the 25th, but we've heard back from that site saying that that may not be the best date, so we're still playing around with what works best. We also realize that around MLK Day, a lot of places close on that Monday, so we're being mindful of it as well. So it'll probably just be sometime in January towards the mid to late part is what I'd say.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we will probably also, so MLK Day, service days required, but we'll probably have a couple of options. We'll say this is the day we want most people to come, but if someone says I can't come that day, we'll see what can kind of count for that time. We've got a little bit of flexibility there. But we want to emphasize the whole thing that MLK, there's a national service ethos and guidelines around MLK Day that they want that to be kind of a service thing, and we want to be part of that.
Okay. And let me ask one more question, please. I hear the required number of service days is 3, but Or is halftime, is that still 3 for halftime or is it 2 as I once thought?
It is 3.
It is 3 for,
Mm-hmm. Yep,
okay,
yep. And on those, you will hear differently in the spring. We may have members joining in February who may only be required to do 2 extra days. In the summer, we have some member to do 1. So that it varies on the length of time of service, but not the hours of your service term.
right.
I will say if there's something that is happening in the community that you'd like to be a part of, if you reach out to me or Laura, a lot of times or sometimes, I don't want to promise anything, we can pre-approve it as a service day for you if something is needed to help fill one of those. But like Laura said, there's some flexibility, so just don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions or if something comes up.
I have a question. How many days do we have for Thanksgiving that are covered like in the hours of AmeriCorps?
It's kind of hard to describe it that way because everybody has their own hours. The benchmark for that week during Thanksgiving was typically less. So we didn't think of it as days off for everyone, but we did think of if you're usually serving 30 hours in this week, probably on Thanksgiving week, you may only serve 20. That's a wild example. But the benchmark is less for holiday weeks. Does that answer the question?
Because for like our service site, we have 2 weeks off, so that's why I was thinking, is that going to make us like behind on hours?
Okay, and I'm sorry, you said Thanksgiving, but you're talking the Christmas, the upcoming.
Sorry, did I say Thanksgiving? I don't even know what I'm talking about.
Okay, cool. So you're closed for 2 weeks during Christmas. Check your benchmark. This is a point to maybe get ahead if you can work extra hours leading up to that. It's also a point where we'll have that package of things to do independently that you could work on from home while your site's closed. We have a lot of students who may be in that position too. Or it may be that you make a plan that once your site is reopened, you get an extra day or a few extra hours in at that point.
Okay, so in the benchmark, it'll say how many hours we're supposed to work, like those weeks of Christmas.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Oh, I'm glad you asked the question because it's a great time for everyone to be thinking of how am I planning for this holiday coming up? Because a lot of sites are closed. Some are not, and we're trying to look for ways to make sure things can continue with service and with you getting the hours you need to get. Nope, not yet. Sorry. Okay. I know this is just reiterating this one piece about staff email. We're going to use that. I also want to acknowledge we've really interestingly found that emails we think we send are not going. And so y'all give us grace if we're like, hey, we've reminded you 3 times, why aren't you answering? That we probably don't understand that what we have sent has not been received. We're also going to make sure and kind of align ourselves to give y'all grace rather than send the email saying, hey, I've sent you this 3 times. We're just trying to really keep in mind and be aware that for some reason our email is wonky. It will help us if we can streamline to always send to staff unless we have that exception. But also we're finding some gaps there. So if you ever get an email that's kind of curt saying we thought we've told you this, just let us know you didn't get it and let's go forward from there. And we'll kind of adjust that way too. And I apologize if there's things I send out things saying, hey, this is the 3rd reminder. What's happening? We're trying to get all that settled. All right. Other reminders, be sure you're meeting with your supervisor. Check in once a week. The guideline part of that is we don't have I should have put the bullets in order. I think the bullet about making sure goals align with service is a conversation to have with your supervisor. Make sure that what the supervisor has you working on matches what the goals are for that site and that your work is contributing to the goals for the site. That's kind of how we're trying to get everything aligned. And, you have part of the picture of what you're working on. Your supervisor is directing that time and it has part of the picture about the goals that they've established. So we just want to put in the reminder to have that communication be open. And if there's ever, if for whatever reason, I've tried to reach out to my supervisor, I can't meet with them, or my supervisor doesn't understand this thing you say I should be talking with them about, let us know if there's any gaps or questions on that kind of thing. And then again, we've already talked about timesheets and benchmark enough, but check it out. It should be with your position description. If you have a position description amendment, it may be there, just depending on what the amendment required, or if it wasn't with your first position description. Okay, we're going to lead into, here's what we're about to do. I'm going to introduce our next section where we're going to hear from Jessica Tudyk, who works with the Mary E. Bivens Foundation. But I wanted to remind y'all of kind of why we do this. Why do we have someone come in to talk about nonprofits in the Panhandle? I think sometimes people think, how does this affect me? But we're trying to set that foundation of knowledge of all our AmeriCorps members to understand first kind of how nonprofits work. That's a lot of what we talked about last time. That's still some of this time, is just how is a nonprofit set up? How does it work? How is it governed? What happens in a nonprofit? Those kind of things, because your service is at a nonprofit. And then also we're leading to kind of a more holistic vision of how your capacity building service is part of supporting a nonprofit, that is part of the kind of ecosystem of nonprofits in the Panhandle. We think it's something that people don't just naturally pick up from the atmosphere about how nonprofits happen and how they work and who runs them and what they do. And so I'm really glad to hear from Jessica about to give us some of that foundational knowledge about nonprofits. So we're going to take a 5-minute break. Stretch your legs, get some water, do what you got to do. And then also there will be a pre-test that we'll stick, I think, in the chat. There'll be a pre-test to take as you come back in.
So thank y'all all for starting to submit your responses for the survey. Right now we are at 14. So if you have not, make sure you click that link in the chat and fill out that pre-quiz. That will help me. So as Laura said earlier, my name is Jessica Tudyk. Well, okay, so my name is now Jessica Hartman, just so you know, right in the middle of it. I like to keep things interesting, so change my last name. Yay. Janae, yep, I meant to text you yesterday. Changed my name. So now it's Jessica Hartman. And I am excited to be back with you guys again. Hold on, let me see if I can pull up that quiz again. There we go. I wanted to see y'all's answers before I got rocking to see how the first session has helped you or not helped you, and what you've done with that or not done with that. Yay, somebody looked up what your NTE code is for your organization. I love that. That's wonderful and super fun for me. Perfect. Okay. All right. So hopefully Sophia is going to continue to monitor the chat for me, because I am the worst when it comes to like figuring out what I'm presenting and you people and the chat. So, but I will say, if you weren't here last time, I'm pretty informal. So if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat or unmute yourself and interrupt and ask the question as we go. Otherwise, I think we are ready to get started. So this is Nonprofit 101, part 2. So part 1 was a month ago. So sorry for the handful of you that missed it because you hadn't started yet. I did send Laura the slides, so you may be able to access those somewhere. Maybe we can reshare them with the newbies, and you can kind of look through that. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me and let me know. But I wanted to start today by going through just for a second and touching base on what we kind of ended last session on, which was the nonprofit life cycle. And so it doesn't look like any of you went back home and figured out where your organization is in terms of the nonprofit life cycle. But I was curious. I know nobody shared that in the survey. Did anybody kind of go back and look at their organization and go, okay, where are we in terms of the things that are kind of on this list in terms of the life cycle of a nonprofit? Did anybody do that? Nope, I hear silence. Matt, I kind of saw you shake your head up and down. Does that mean you did?
I did. Just seeing where we're at, what kind of the trajectory we're moving into and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So Matt, I would still call your organization pretty new. I know you guys have
Yeah.
been around for a few years, but in terms of the life cycle, you're still new. And so there are some organizations that I encounter that have been around for 18, 20, 25 years, and they're still in kind of that startup phase, right? They haven't really moved beyond that. And so I know that Matt has worked really hard to take his organization, especially because I feel like you were in startup and maybe you're moving into growth.
Absolutely.
Like,
Yeah, for
absolutely.
sure. For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it takes concerted effort, right? It doesn't just happen overnight. So
For sure.
Matt can verify that.
Yeah.
So I think that when you look at the nonprofit organization that you're working with, identifying where it is in the life cycle is really helpful, especially as we move towards that conversation about capacity building, because the type of capacity building or the things that you do when it's in the idea stage, capacity building looks very different than when you roll over and you're in the maturity stage. That capacity building is very different. And so just knowing where your organization's at in the life cycle, I think will help you as you start having those conversations about capacity building, because you can build volunteers, right? We'll talk about kind of human capital. You can work on volunteers, but what you're doing in the idea and startup phase in terms of building those volunteers, it may be more volunteer policies, it may be more recruitment strategies versus maturity, which may be like, let's talk about new recruitment strategies or what that looks like. It just could be your capacity building could be driven a bit by where the organization is in terms of the life cycle. So don't forget that that is out there. So this was one of the questions that came up. So I'm going to spend the first few minutes just kind of touching base on some of the questions that came at the end of the last session. So hopefully the people that asked those are here again. But one of the questions that came up a couple of times was, how do you start a nonprofit? And I would say don't, which is a terrible response, and I know that. But my response is don't. Like, do not start a new profit. Don't start a new one. And then like the little asterisk is like, unless you have to, like, right? So a lot of people have really great, fantastic ideas and wonderful ways of service, or people who need help in the community and they want to reach out and do that, which is why that question comes about, right? I want to meet this need. I want to help in this way. I think the nonprofit's the best way to do it. How do I start a nonprofit? And I would just say, don't. So anyone that calls me and says, I'm going to start a new nonprofit, I just say, please don't. Try to find a way to not start a new nonprofit. And we're about to talk a little bit more about why that's my answer. But there are already so many nonprofits in our community. They're doing great work. Try to find an organization that already exists that's doing what you're doing, or that you could be a program of what they're already making happen.
I wholeheartedly agree with that.
Yeah. So for example, Matt, you were my example, right? So if you really want to help foster kiddos when they or families when they get a new foster kiddo in, and I don't care where you're in the panhandle, I would encourage you to not start your own. I would encourage you to call Matt, talk to Matt and say, hey, I live in Wheeler and I would like to start supporting this. And Matt will go, fantastic. Let's start a closet in your community. Let's do what we do with these placement packages in your community, and I'll help you make it happen. And you'll just be an arm or a satellite office of Panhandle Orphan Care Network.
Exactly.
Right?
That same conversation happened this spring. Exactly.
Yep, absolutely. And so that's just one example of what you could do to not start a nonprofit. So that's my recommendation. However, if you're going to start a nonprofit, I did want to give you some resources and information that you could use to do that. And so I would encourage you to go to the Council of Nonprofits. And Laura, I've got to think of a good way to share this. I just didn't do it well. Absolutely. I'll share my slides. You'll see those links there. You'll have them. There may be a better way to do the links so you guys can have a list of them. So I'll work on something that's a little better formatted. But the Council of Nonprofits is a great place to go if you're wanting to know about nonprofits and specifically about how to start a nonprofit. They have a page solely dedicated to how to start a nonprofit, and it'll work you through the steps and what to do. One of the biggest things that they encourage you is to consult with local expertise. So an attorney, an accountant, someone familiar with the laws regarding nonprofits, because they want to ensure that as you're a new nonprofit, you're complying with all the state and local and federal laws. And that is one of the biggest things. And it's costly and it takes time, but it's the most important piece to make sure that you've got it structured. So again, if you can kind of glide on the coattails of a nonprofit that's already in existence, it's easier, it makes sense. Try to partner, try to do it that way. I also shared, because if you're going to start your nonprofit, you have to understand the legal requirements. And so the Secretary of State for the state of Texas, that's that link down there below. And it's the Secretary of State's website for if you're going to start a nonprofit in the state of Texas. I would encourage you to go there and learn all the things and understand what it means, or go to an attorney or lawyer who can help you with all that paperwork and all make sure it's all set up correctly. Is that fair? But hopefully you go home and you just don't start a nonprofit. That's my goal, which is a terrible goal, but that is what it is. So there is that information on that. Another question that came up quite a bit in the last session was like, how do I know if it's a good nonprofit, right? How do I evaluate it to make sure it's doing good things? And so I wanted to share a couple of tools with you in case that's a direction that you'd like to pursue and look into a nonprofit. So the first is going to be, it's called the IRS Select Check tool. Also, today has a lot of just resources and guides I'm pointing you to because it's a pretty big overview, but again, people wanted information about nonprofits here. So the IRS Select Check tool, and I put the link there, but you can just Google IRS Select Check tool or even just Select Check tool and it'll get you there. And it's a tax exempt organization search. So if you'll remember, we talked last time about how tax exempt does not necessarily equal nonprofit. Right? Tax exempt is that bigger umbrella. And then under that tax exempt umbrella, there's nonprofits, right? And so this is tax exempt organizations. And so you can see there's a big database, but this is the IRS. And so you can search by EIN or the employee identification number, or you can use that box and search by name. Just know, like any database, you have to type the name correctly and it's their legal name, not what they might be doing business as. So let me think of a good one that is not doing business as what their legal name is. So has anyone heard of Amarillo Children's Home? I was saying Matt better shake his head up and down. Yeah, so there's an organization called Amarillo Children's Home. It's a placement agency, not placement agency. That is the wrong terminology. But kiddos who enter into foster care may go live at Amarillo Children's Home for a.
And they're actually opening their own child placement agency.
You're right, they are. That's their new program, but they're not in general a child placement agency, though they're going to be now. But anyways, kiddos who are in foster care may go live there if they don't have a foster family to go live with. And so, but their legal name is Presbyterian Home for Children. So if you search Amarillo Children's Home in this IRS Select Check tool, you will not find Amarillo Children's Home because their legal name is Presbyterian Home for Children. So just know with this one, you got to have a legal name, not what they're doing business as. But you can search it and you can find information. So I did a quick little search and I just searched, if you kind of see on that where you can search for state, I just did Texas and search. And there are 207,536 tax exempt organizations in the state of Texas. I went ahead and went a little further and I said, Amarillo, tell me how many are in Amarillo. There are 1,598 tax exempt organizations in Amarillo. I looked to see where some of the other organizations that are placement agencies, I didn't do all of the cities or whatever, but Canyon, there was 195 tax exempt organizations. Canyon, y'all, Canyon's tiny, and there's 195 tax exempt organizations there. Nobody else looks surprised as I do. That's insane. Again, don't start your own nonprofit. Go find one, use them. Wellington, I know we had someone from Wellington. There are 44 tax exempt organizations in Wellington, Texas. And then there's Cactus. I don't know if they're on the call today, but there's 4 in Cactus. So I thought that was just helpful. You can go further when you find one of those organizations. You can actually click on it and get information about it. So I just picked a random one. And I'll be honest, the reason I picked Dodson Cemetery Association was because if you'll look, see the gray part at the top where it has their tax ID number, so their EIN, and then it has their name, where they're located. And then on the far right, it says Pub 78 data, Form 990N, and auto revocation list. I picked them because they had all 3. So I could show you what all 3 of those things mean. And so you can see information, you click on it and you can see where they are. But when you click on that auto revocation list, so this is a tax exempt organization where the IRS just automatically revoked their tax exempt status, probably because they didn't do something they were supposed to do. In this case, I will almost guarantee you, based on the revocation date, that it was all the new guidelines that nonprofits have to, and tax exempt entities have to submit their 990s every year. And if they go for 3 years and don't do it, the IRS goes, yank, you don't have your tax exempt status anymore, right? And so if they're not tax exempt, if their tax exempt status isn't active, I would consider them not an organization you would want to support. Anyway, so you can have information about whether their tax exempt status got revoked. You really can't understand why. This one you can see it was reinstated. So in 2017, it was reinstated. So I just think they lost it because they weren't doing what they're supposed to do. Someone got involved and said, oh, you're supposed to do this every year. And they said, okay, and they started doing it again. But I will also tell you that exemption type there, the 501c13, it tells you that they're a cemetery company. They're not a 501c3 nonprofit organization, right? So again, that's the IRS is tax exempt, not just nonprofits. You can also click on that Pub 78 data form, which tells you if they're considered a 501c3 nonprofit. So again, I'm trying to balance this like IRS guidelines and what they say and like what does that mean for us like normal people, right? And that's a hard balance to make. But Pub 78 is actually the publication where all the 501c3 nonprofit charitable organizations, whatever word we want to use there, are all put into. And so the fact that they are, yes, listed there, you want to go see, okay, what is their deductibility code? Well, you can see that they're an EO, which means they're an organization described in Section 170C of the Internal Revenue Code, other than a public charity or private foundation. So it just gives you more details about how that organization is structured and what they are doing. Usually, I guess I didn't save this. I didn't get high enough, but you can see if they're a private foundation and private operating foundation. You can see if they're a charitable entity. You can see if they're a government entity and they have it that way. You can just see why they're considered a part of that tax exempt, where they're eligible to receive tax deductible charitable contributions, right? And then that last one, I didn't click the Dodson Cemetery Association because they were too small. They didn't have it. So I switched on you, another organization that's represented today, but I clicked on Don Harrington Discovery Center Foundation, right here in Amarillo. And you can actually get copies of their returns. And so when someone asks me to evaluate a nonprofit to see if they're good, you go to their 990 and you see what they're doing. That 990 is going to show you where their money's coming from, where their money's going, what programs they're doing. But it's very complicated and it's IRS because it's a tax form. So it's not the best. I mean, it is the best place to go, but most people it's a little bit inaccessible because you have to learn how to read 990s, which if your trajectory is to work in a nonprofit and ultimately lead a nonprofit, you're going to have to learn about 990s anyway. But if you don't know how to read them, it's a little bit more complicated. I wanted to share something that might be a little more accessible, even though it has its limitations. And that is GuideStar. Has anyone heard of GuideStar? One, two, couple. Okay, so it's new for some, not for others. So GuideStar is a great place to go, and GuideStar will narrow down what you're searching. You won't have as much information about the things you find, but it will narrow down to the nonprofits we're usually familiar with. And so you can see how, like, in the select check tool for Texas, there were 207,536 tax exempt organizations. In GuideStar in Texas, there's only about 150,000. And so that's really more the nonprofits, the charitable entities that we think of when we think of public charities. Does that make sense? Amarillo down to 1,146. I have to tell you, Canyon got complicated because there's a place in further south in Texas called Canyon Lake. And I couldn't find a way to like get Canyon Lake off and Canyon in. So I'd had to do some more work and I just kind of gave up. But Wellington, there's only 35. And then Cactus, there was 3. So it helps you. And it's a little more readable in terms of what you're finding. But again, it's going to tell you what kind of, maybe the NTE code. It's maybe going to tell you the like contact information, if it's Pub 78 verified, and then it's going to give you a link to the 990s. And so if you can't read the 990s on your own, it's still going to be limited in what you're able to ascertain about a nonprofit. Does that make sense? So the next one I'm going to use the word recommend, but I'm going to use it very advisedly. But there's a place called Charity Navigator. Anybody heard of Charity Navigator? One? Only one? Okay, only maybe 2. So Charity Navigator is a place where someone said, hey, we've got to be able to evaluate these nonprofits and see if they're worthwhile, see if they're worth supporting. I don't love Charity Navigator because I think it uses some very objective criteria to evaluate nonprofits. And sometimes that subjective criteria is really important to take into account, and they just can't. And so Charity Navigator is really objective. And if it's a really small nonprofit, it doesn't even meet the criteria to be on Charity Navigator. So Matt, I don't know if you've ever tried to look, but I bet if you look up Panhandle Orphan Care Network on Charity Navigator, I bet it's not there because you're too small. you
Yeah.
don't hit that criteria. And so it also is limited. Now, if you want to look at some of the larger like healthcare nonprofits or educational institution nonprofits, things like that, they're going to be on there. But in terms of some of the smaller, like Another Chance House, I bet Another Chance House isn't even on there. Discovery Center might be big enough, but you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of nonprofits that just don't hit the target level to be on this because they don't have that objective data because they're not big enough. What I will say about that though, that is interesting is one, you can look them up and kind of get Charity Navigator's score on them if they're big enough. The interesting thing here and that this link is evaluating charities. And so Charity Navigator actually walks you through what their process is for evaluating a nonprofit and whether or not it's worth supporting. And so if you want to kind of read that and take some of that and go, yeah, that makes sense. I want to look at that when I'm looking at a nonprofit, or yeah, I would love to know what that means and how that works with that nonprofit. It just might be a starting point for your kind of thought process around looking at a nonprofit to see whether or not it's worth supporting. So limited tool, but still a tool nonetheless. My recommendation though is once you've found a nonprofit and you want to look into them, look at them on the GuideStar or find their 990, go to their website, go visit them. I know many of you now have been working in a nonprofit for a while. Wouldn't you love it if someone showed up at your door or gave you a phone call and said, hey, I'm curious to learn more about you and what you're doing. Can I come out and see you guys? Can you give me a tour? Can you tell me what's happening? They would love it, right? You would love it if someone did that. And so be that person that calls them and says, hey, I want to learn more about you and what you're doing. Just show up on their doorstep so they don't have to find you, and then hear about what they're doing and learn about the nonprofit like on a one-on-one basis. That's really my recommendation. One thing that I'll tell you, Charity Navigator and a lot of other people tend to look at when they evaluate a nonprofit. I thought this, because it's pretty common, was something I wanted to make note of. Two reasons. One, if you're evaluating a nonprofit, you may want to look at it. But two, if you are the nonprofit, you want to know what yours looks like so that if someone asks a question, you can answer it and address it. And it's called the Program Efficiency Formula, or Program Ratio. Has anybody ever heard of Program Ratio or Program Efficiency Formula? No, brand new, maybe to everybody. And this is a really, I don't do math, you guys, very well. And this is a formula, so it kind of scares me. But the Program Efficiency Formula is basically looking at how much money do you spend on your programs versus how much money do you spend overall, right? And so hopefully I can kind of make this make sense. But there is an organization, and I'm not going to share who they are. They're not local, so don't worry. But if you look up their program ratio, if you give them $1, right? If I donate them $1, 92 cents of that is going to go to administrative and fundraising. And 8 cents of that dollar is going to go to their programs, which is actually helping veterans. Right? So do you want your dollar as a donor, 8 cents of a dollar to go to the actual program of helping veterans and 92 cents of it to go to administrative and fundraising? Anybody? Nope. I see a lot of no's, right? Like if I give $1 and I want it to go to veterans, I probably want 92 cents of it to go to the veterans, right? And I'm okay with 8 cents of it going to admin and fundraising, right? But I want the majority of my money to go into the actual program, serving the clients, whether that be veterans or foster children or kiddos coming to learn education or food, right? Whatever that looks like. I want, as a person, me, I want most of my money to go to the actual programs. And that's what this program ratio means, right? So if you calculate this and you find that that nonprofit has and I couldn't tell you what it is right there, but you can see, like, again, if only 8% of their your donations going to programs, you have to decide if that's worth your donation. And I would say most people, no. But you don't know this unless you look into it. So you can see kind of the gold standard or the best practice is that at least 80% of your donation or your expenses go towards programs, right? This says it's too low if it's under 70%. I would say the challenge with the program ratio is that each organization's a little bit different. And so, like, for example, museums, Discovery Center, your program ratio is going to be a little bit lower than most because a lot of your funding has to go towards the exhibits and the people and the docents and the, right, like the administration of the museum. And so museums tend to have a little bit lower of a program ratio. Human services tends to have a bit of a higher one. And so again, like, if there was a human service organization that was serving clients, you have to decide what you're comfortable with. Are you comfortable with half your dollar going towards programs and half towards admin and fundraising? Maybe some people, I'm not, right? I want more of my money to go to programs. Now, the problem is what this has kind of forced people to do is go 100% of your dollar is going to go to programs. And they try to find other ways of raising the administration and the fundraising support cost. And it's really not fair to say 100% of your donation is going to go to programs, because then you don't have a strong organization. So like, if your goal is that 100% of my dollar goes to programs, I think you've set yourself up for failure, because no nonprofit can function with 100% of your dollars going to programs and none of it going to the capacity and none of it going to staffing or administration or overhead, right, for a building. So just keep in mind that there are limitations to this, but I do think the reason it's a common one is because it makes sense, right? I don't want 8% of my dollar to go to programs and 92% of it to go elsewhere. Does that make sense? Okay, if you want more information about the program efficiency formula, well, let me know, or the program ratio, we can talk about that. But I think it's a good way for you to kind of gauge what's happening. Okay, any questions about the couple things we've just covered? Okay, I'm going to move on and we're going to talk about nonprofit funding, because this is another question. I thought that was a good segue into nonprofit funding. So what I'm going to talk about now is just kind of some overarching stuff about nonprofit funding. So one of the questions that's always asked is, well, where do nonprofits get their money, right? And so here's some examples of places that nonprofits will get their money. I think that there is a misnomer or a myth that nonprofits don't charge for their services. And while that's true for some nonprofits do not charge for their services. Matt, for example, he does not charge a family a dime for them to bring a placement package for the foster kiddo that they've just brought in, right? But other organizations do have fees for service. So family support services, for example, they have counseling services they provide. To help that be sustainable, they can't offer those counseling services 100% free of charge for all their clients, right? So they charge a fee, and usually it's on a sliding scale. So based on their income, they either pay a lot or a little for the counseling service. But that's one of the ways that nonprofits get their money. And it's actually a pretty big way that a lot of nonprofits get their money. So charging something as a nonprofit is okay. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Individual donations, corporate donations, so donations from companies, grants from lots of different sources we don't have time to go into today. Membership dues, so some organizations have members that pay to be part of it. Fundraising events, which again, even at the fundraising event, it's a lot of individual donations, maybe corporate sponsorships, things like that. Earned income, which is the same as fee for service, kind of, but a little different. Product sales. So a lot of people think nonprofits don't sell products. And I think hopefully last time we dispelled that myth, and nonprofits can sell products. And sometimes that's a way of them making money to invest in their mission. Investment income. So this is one that I know a lot of people don't talk about, and we don't have any time to talk about endowments. But if you have an endowment at your nonprofit, you can get some interest income off of that to help fund what you're doing. So again, if you've invested dollars, you have a source of income for that. And then in-kind donations. And that's not an exhaustive list. That's just to give you an idea that funding for nonprofits can come a lot of different directions. Now, that doesn't mean that your nonprofit gets money from a foundation or that your nonprofit gets investment income, right? These are just all the possible places that you can get funding from. So nonprofits have what they call a funding model. Anybody ever heard of a funding model before?
Jessica, there is a question in the chat.
Yeah. What's up?
Somebody said, can't a nonprofit get in trouble with someone if they are, like the one you said, giving only 8 cents are going to the charity or the programs? Is that something that you get slapped on the hand for?
There's not a law against that, which is really crazy. But also makes sense, because where do you put that law? So yeah, no, there are no legal ramifications for that organization. Now, there could potentially be some ramifications if they're telling people 100% of your money is going to go towards these veterans, and then it doesn't. But if you look at it, they don't do that. They're very careful to not say 100% of your money or 80%. They're just support veterans. And that is what they do. That is their mission. So there's no legal ramifications for only spending 8% of your donations on that.
I have one now, kind of inspired by that from
Yeah.
advertising background. Are nonprofits, do they fall under jurisdiction of the Better Business Bureau as well?
I would assume so, yes. So you could, because they're corporations. And so, yes, that would be kind of the, what you could do is, I guess, you report them to the Better Business Bureau. But again, that's not necessarily something, it's unethical, I think. If we're in an ethics course right now, I would tell you, I think that's unethical, but there's nothing illegal about what they're doing. So yeah, and I don't know that there's anything the Better Business Bureau could do because there's no consequences for that. Now, if a nonprofit was giving money to their stakeholders or something, you know, like a for-profit operates, that would get them in trouble. But that's not. They're paying themselves to do the work a lot, and they're only doing a little bit of the work. But that's nothing against the rules there. Okay, so what is a funding model? So a funding model is defined, of course, by Bridgespan as I can't say that word this Friday afternoon. Methodical. There we go. I'll get there. There's a method behind it. An institutionalized approach to building a reliable revenue base that will support an organization's core programs and services. So basically, it's a nonprofit sitting down and going, where is our money going to come from, right? And it could be that 100% of your money comes from donations. That's not really very sustainable, right? But that could be how your funding model works. So in essence, a nonprofit funding model combines the different funding sources into a constellation that's unique to every nonprofit. So again, that's why that was just a list of potential funding sources. For example, one nonprofit might be funded 50% through grants, 30% through events, 15% through a membership program, and 5% through in-kind donations. Another one might be 70% funded through a major donor program, 20% through direct mail fundraising, and 10% through events. Like different types of nonprofits are suited to different funding sources depending upon their mission and programs, right? So Don Harrington Discovery Center, y'all have memberships, right? You, like any one of us on this call, we can pay to be a member and we get benefits for being a member, but that's one of their ways that they get their funding. Matt is never going to be a membership organization, right? He's not going to require his families to be members to get access to the placement packages. That's just not the model that works. So, and I'm picking on Matt a lot today, so sorry about that, Matt, but it is what it is, right? So each nonprofit funds their work.
Pick on me all you want, Jessica.
Fantastic, thanks, Matt, appreciate it. But yeah, so each nonprofit looks different. So that's why you can't, with one like brush, stroke all nonprofits and go, oh, they all get individual donations. Maybe some don't. And maybe they get 10% individual donations, or maybe they get 100. It just depends on their funding model. So here's a couple, I just put this out here for anybody who really cares about this. Most people probably are not, but there are different types of funding models. And actually they've kind of come up with 10 of the main ones. Again, that's just 10 of the main most common ones. There are many other funding sources and it's each unique to its nonprofit. But if you wanted to understand a little bit more about the different types of funding models, you could look here because you may go, oh, that makes sense for my organization to be a beneficiary builder. Let me see what that looks like. And that may help you in terms of like how you fundraise and what that looks like. So I put the link to that there so you can learn about those different funding models. But I think this is the slide that'll make more sense to people, right? So if you look at that top left one, that's one option of a funding model per se. So this nonprofit, you can see, gets 50% of their income from fees for services, right, from private sources. And then you can see they get 23.1% in the green from the government. And so almost 75% of their funding comes from fees, which is fine. That's not bad. I don't know what this nonprofit does, but it's not a Matt Dara. It's not a, a Pain and Orphan Care Network. But 75% of it comes from fees. And then you have about 13% private contributions. You have about 10% government grants. You have some investment income. And then you have some other random small things that help fill out that full circle. Top right-hand side, you can see 45% comes from fees and services, 20% from private sources, which is like contributions and grants. There's a little bitty bit of other, the 3%, right? And then there's some government fees and grants for that one. That won't fit the model for a lot of you guys here, but it's different. Bottom left-hand one, we can look at this funding source. You can see almost half of their funding comes from investment income. Wouldn't that be nice to only have to raise half your money every year because the other half is just coming in consistently from your investment income? Now, it comes with its own challenges because as the investment portfolios go up and down, right? Like you either are doing well or you're not doing well, but that's fantastic. And then you can see there's some sale of drugs to non-patients. So some of that product sales, government appropriations, so probably government contracts. They lumped a lot into one, contributions and bequests, rental of some hospital space, and then sale of meals to non-patients. So that's probably a hospital somewhere. And then you can see on the bottom right, this is interesting because it says recommended best practices for nonprofits. And that's really hard to say it's the best practice depending upon the type of nonprofit you do, how big you are, etc. But I will say this makes a lot of sense to me, and it's more standard to what I see here locally. So about 70%, maybe even 75% comes from individual contributions. So that's one-time or monthly donations, major gifts, event fees, and or proceeds, right? So events kind of are lumped into that as well. You can see about 10 to 15% maybe from some corporate and or government funding, depending upon how that works. And then some miscellaneous income like admission fees to events, awareness or organization branded goods sales, ticket sales, etc. And then you can see some private grant funding from foundations, larger nonprofits, or maybe some community foundations, things like that. Does that make sense? So basically, like your funding model depends on what organization you are and what you're doing and what makes sense and what works. Clear as mud? Yeah, I think so. Laura, I just have to tell you, I had a really hard time coming up with some really consistent things to talk about with nonprofits because I was like, I should be able to go, here's the funding model, but that's not how nonprofits operate. They're all different and all varies. Were you going to say something, Laura?
I just said they're so different. Yeah, we see that with
They're
our partners.
so different. And again, like WT institution, very different than, I know we don't have anyone from City of Cactus this year, but City of Cactus versus Wheeler Senior Citizens, you know, they're all so different in what they do, that when you've met one nonprofit, you've met one nonprofit, right? That's it. So here I wanted to kind of bring this, you can see this is from Council of Nonprofits again. But this is sort of like an overarching, like big 40,000 foot view of nonprofits and where their money comes from. And you can see about 50% comes from fee for services, right? So if you look at all the nonprofits, which again is going to include your large, yes. Nope, that wasn't for me. It's going to include your large hospitals, your large institutions, which, you know, take up a lot of kind of the space in this, but half of it comes from fees for service. Then about 32% comes from government grants and contracts. And the interesting thing is right there is about 80%. Most of you on this call don't work in an organization that's true for. So I'll just tell you, most of you don't. And so even though like the standard is about 8% or 9% from individuals, most on this call, your individual contributions is a much larger piece of that pie, probably closer to 75 or 80% of that pie comes from individuals. You have some foundations, 3%, 1.5% bequests, which is kind of through wills, right? So an individual leaves an organization amount of money in their will. So when they die, then that money goes to the organization. So that's still an individual. And then 1% corporations, and then there's a little bit that comes from some other things. But again, each nonprofit's different. So you got to look at yours and see what it makes sense. Giving USA. Has anybody heard about Giving USA? A couple yeses. So Giving USA, they do research every year about what the giving looks like to nonprofits. And so you can see in 2023, $557 billion was given in the USA. So that was Americans for charitable giving. And so then you look at it and you go, okay, well, that's a lot of money, but where did it come from? And so almost 8% of that is giving by individuals. So again, like if your funding model mirrors this, you're probably pretty accurate to the reality of what's happening, right? On the average scale for an average nonprofit. But 67% giving by individuals, 20% by foundations, 8% by bequests, which again is individuals, and then 7% by corporations. And so one thing I'll just point out here is if 67% comes from individuals, 8% comes from bequests, which are individuals, right? And then a lot of the foundations, and the reason that number's grown is because individuals start a foundation with their philanthropy, right? So like Tim Tebow Foundation, 10 years ago didn't exist. He got a lot of success. He created his own foundation. So still kind of individual driven. A lot of the money is coming from individuals. So just know that your organization is not going to live and die by grants. It's going to live by individual support. Is that fair? Okay, keep rocking along. Where do the charitable dollars go? I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this slide. Again, this is still Giving USA. So if you just search Giving USA, you can get a lot of details about where the money's coming from and where it's going. But you can see 25% of it went to religion. So that's still very much, I think when we think about nonprofits, we skip over churches. Churches still get a majority of the charitable contributions. 14% to human services, 14% to education, 13% to foundations, which continues to grow because again, individuals keep giving their money to foundations or starting their own foundations. Public society benefit 10%, then health 9%, international affairs 5%. If you're on the call and you're from arts, culture, and humanities, 4%. Sorry, you guys are so small. Environment, animals, even smaller. And then those individuals is kind of like that. I don't know how to put that, but like, what's the crowdsource funding for people when they have emergencies, medical issues? Someone tell it to me.
GoFundMe.
GoFundMe, thank you. I'm like, no, somebody's gonna know what I'm talking about. That's kind of like the GoFundMe stuff. So anyways, that's just kind of helpful to know like where the money is going. So let's talk just for a second. I don't want this to scare you. Again, I'm giving you a lot of resources today. So if you really want to dive into it more and learn more, you can. But there's this idea of this donor pyramid, right? So if most of our money comes from individuals, what do those donors look like? Or what do we do with that? And so you can see from your perspective, from a nonprofit, you're looking at a donor pyramid going, okay, the bottom, we have our universe of prospects. So it's like all the people that could give to our organization, right? And then you have these newly acquired donors, and you usually acquire them through direct mail or telemarketing or fundraising or door to door, right? Once you've got them in as a newly acquired donor, you want to move them up this donor pyramid. And so I'll say when you talk about sustainability, which we're really not going to talk about till next time, and building capacity, you want to move your donors up, right? You don't want a ton of newly one-time donors, right? That's not going to help you continue to sustain and move forward, right? And so once you've got them in, you really want to take your universe of prospects, get them in that funnel or that pyramid, and then just move them up. And so if you're in an organization that has a planned giving program, you are likely not in the idea or startup life cycle of a nonprofit, right? Because you don't have donors who you've been able to move up this pyramid. You're not to that point where you need a planned giving program. But organizations that have been around for maybe 10 or 15 years, who are moving from maybe the growth into maturity, right? That's where you start considering a major gifts program, right? To get those planned givers to where you can continue to move them up in that pyramid. So different ideas, different kind of programs, right? You have your fundraising kind of overarching concept here. And that's really all I'm going to say on this slide, which sounds and feels like not enough because it's really a very broad like overview of here's a pyramid, good luck. But if you want to look into it, if you're thinking about fundraising and what that looks like, does anybody know if they have a planned giving program at their organization? Matt, I know you don't, you're not there yet.
Yeah, I wish we did.
I know. When you're starting, you're going, I wish we were there, but it just takes time to get there. I'm looking at some other people.
Another Chance House is on, Owen is on, and he's part, I was just about to call back to why this matters to AmeriCorps members. We have members who may be specifically relating to like the donor database. They're doing outreach related to donors, or they're collecting data related to donors, or doing different things. I think some of Madeline's communication might be a little bit focused on reaching out to donors. I think a lot of these things, just to call us back if you're starting to drift, going, this has nothing to do with what I do every day. Your organization is run on fundraising, and fundraising comes back to helping pay your living allowance. So this does matter. This all is related to the work that is happening and the work that allows AmeriCorps to partner with those organizations.
And that's a great point, Laura, because you're probably not in charge of creating this program or anything, but you may have a piece to play in this. And so that is helpful to know where you're at in that and why it's important and the work that you're doing in terms of building that. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. Okay, so we're going to take a break after 2 more slides, but 2 more things. So there are there is tons of information about fundraising out there. Tons of ideas, tons of thoughts, tons of concepts, tons of ways to go about it, tons of just lots and lots and lots of information about fundraising. I liked this guy. His name is Ruben Mays, and he talks about these 3 tenets. And this is where the only information I wanted to talk about fundraising specifically, because again, I know AmeriCorps members don't fundraise, but again, you work at organizations that are fundraising. Okay, but when you talk about fundraising, you are actually matching the needs of the donor with the needs of the institution. And so I think a lot of people are really scared of fundraising and being a part of it, but it's not about you. And I think taking that pressure off you, right? Like it's not about Jessica asking for money. It's about the organization and taking a donor who has a passion and connecting it with what the organization is doing. If you'll keep that perspective, I think it takes a lot of the pressure off of that. So that's why, again, communication to funders is or to potential donors is so important. Newsletters are so important, keeping them engaged, right? Like it's about connecting those donors who care about what you're doing with what you're doing. So it's not about you. It is not.
Jessica, you need to come talk to my board.
We take it personal, don't we? But it's all about, and I think, there's some WT folks on here, WT Foundation, WT, the 125 effort. Anybody heard about that, right? What WT was doing to raise some funding, right? I want to tell you one of the reasons that they have been so successful is if you look at the way that they're doing that fundraising, they're not going, hey, we need a new whatever building, y'all help support this building, and then trying to find the donors that match. They're going out to a donor and going, Laura, what do you care about? What do you want to see happen at WT? You're an alumni. What was your experience? What did that look like? And when Laura goes, well, you know what? I had to study in this dank basement in this library and it was awful. If you could renovate that, students would do better. They go, fantastic. Let's make that happen, right? So they're finding the donor and finding what the donor's passionate about and connecting that. And so, anyways, that's one of the reasons they've been really successful. But it's logical. It's not logical. It is emotional, right? So when you start talking about grants, fundraising gets a little more logical because we want to know the data and the information, but it's an emotional thing. What do you, the donor, care about, and how can the organization come alongside you, and vice versa? And then fundraising is also not a one-time thing, right? It's a series of meetings in a defined period of time, right? It's not in and out. It's continual. And so if you keep that in mind, those 3 things will kind of help you. He's got a little 16-minute TED Talk video about fundraising, which I just thought was really good to kind of, if you keep those 3 things in mind, all the other stuff needs to align underneath that. And the last thing I'll say about fundraising is we have there's a national organization that talks about fundraising. It's called the Association for Fundraising Professionals. Anybody heard of it? A couple people. And so if you are going to move in that direction after your AmeriCorps service, right? I know that's not right now, you're not fundraising right now, but the Association of Fundraising Professionals has a local chapter, and it is the Texas Plains chapter. So I put the link to their website and their Facebook page, but it's just Association of Fundraising Professionals, Texas Plains. That is a group of professional fundraisers, and that's what they do. And so if you want to learn more about fundraising and what you should do, I would encourage you to get involved with AFP. I think they have like a cheap student membership for anyone who's a student at WT. But you can learn a lot about fundraising there, and techniques and thoughts and hows and whys and whatnot, and network with people who are doing the same thing. They also have a code of ethical standards around fundraising, and I would encourage you to kind of look at that code if you care about that. But it's for the fundraising professional and what guides your work as a fundraiser. So I'm going to leave it right there, and I'm going to take a break. We're going to stop, and we're going to come back and talk about nonprofit governance, which I know is super exciting, and everyone's really excited to dig into. Management of the nonprofit is what covers the day-to-day operations of the organization. So it's essentially the executive director and the team members take care of the regular activities that are put into operation. They're putting into operation the vision that's set by the board of directors. And so when you look at this idea of governance versus management, just remember that governance is the job of the board. Management is the job of the staff. or volunteers if you're an all volunteer run organization. Does that make sense? Now, this gets a little bit tricky because has anyone worked for or like been involved with an organization that is 100% volunteer run and it's the board members that are doing the work? Yeah, so that's when it gets tricky, right? And so there's this idea of, so the board is supposed to set the strategic direction, the policy, and the fiscal oversight for the organization. So that's the money oversight for the organization. The staff is the management and administration. And so they call this the invisible yellow line or the virtual yellow line. And they compare it kind of like in football, right? When someone's playing a football game, do they ever see a yellow line on the field? Like if they're in the game, helmet on, running, like, do they see a yellow line on the field? Like, no, they don't. They don't see the yellow line of where they're supposed to go and how far they need to get, right? Us watching from home, right? Like on our couch, comfy with drinks and snacks, like, do we see a yellow line? Yeah, we see that yellow line. And so that's kind of the idea, right? Is that there's this invisible yellow line that's kind of moving, and it depends on how your organization is structured as to where that line sort of sits. But at the end of the day, the board is responsible for the strategic direction, the policy, and the fiscal oversight. The staff is responsible for the management and administration of the organization. Is that fair? So board of directors, the powers that board of directors has are actually defined in the articles of incorporation and the bylaws. Has anybody heard of articles of incorporation or bylaws before? I know Matt has. Yeah, quite a few, right? And so what the board can and can't do is actually defined in those articles of incorporations and the bylaws. So that's why those documents are really important to an organization. The board is directly accountable for the actions and policy of the organization. And I think that's really important to know. So as you consider like serving on a board for an organization, the board is ultimately responsible. The body being the board is responsible. Here's a good one. Board members are actually financially liable for the actions of an organization. Right? So when you say yes and agree to be on a board, you could be legally responsible for the finances, right? And that's why we won't go into it today, but like there's all these things that you have to do as a board member to make sure you're not fiscally responsible, like have to pay for it. And there's this thing called directors and officers insurance that you should have to make sure it covers some of those things. In Texas, the requirement is you have to have a minimum of 3 board members. So you can't have 1 or 2 board members, you have to have 3. And I don't think there's a maximum, but anyway, there are 3 legal duties for a board member: the duty of care, the duty of obedience, and the duty of loyalty. And so you should expect board members, or as a board member, duty of care means you act reasonably and in good faith in the interest of an organization. So this is why, well, that's just if there were legal issues and something comes up, the legal system is going to go, you as a board member, did you act with your duty of care? Did you act reasonably and in good faith in the interest of the organization? If you didn't, then you did something you shouldn't do. Duty of obedience, you adhere to the mission of the organization. So again, when they're looking at it from a legal perspective, did you adhere to the mission of the organization? And then lastly, the duty of loyalty. So you serve the corporation and avoid competing interests. And so this is why conflict of interest policies are so important. If anyone's heard of a conflict of interest policy, if you have a board member who also is a contractor, and then your board, like the organization, engages that company to do the work, you have some potential conflict of interest. And so where does that person's loyalty lie? Does it lie to their company or does it lie to the nonprofit? And it gets really tricky. And so that's why there's a lot of separation for that, because board members have a duty of loyalty. Okay, so every board members must have documents, and I would say this is every organization's must have documents. But again, if the board is ultimately responsible for setting the organization's direction and vision and mission, right, then this is important for the board to have. And so again, I'm not going to go through all of these things, but you can see articles of incorporation, bylaws, policies. So when we talk about capacity building, if that policy section is a little bit wiggly because you don't have those policies in place, that may be a way to build the capacity of the organization, get those policies in place. The board processes are something that you should look at as well. Those job descriptions and charters and agendas, right? And so those documents all like guide the board's action and then ultimately drive where the organization moves and what they do. But again, board, policy, staff, day to day. Okay. So real quick, in the last few minutes we have, we're just going to talk for a minute about human capital or human resource management. And I'll tell you, I did a whole semester on human resource management for nonprofits. So obviously we can't go into much, if all of that today, or if much of it today. But as we all know, the nonprofit sector is built on human resources, right? Which is the energy, efficiency, and passion of its employees and its volunteers, right? So it's really critical to have good processes and procedures in place for your human capital, right? This is kind of going back to what I just mentioned a while ago, but like this could be the organization hierarchy of a working board, right? So an organization that's maybe in startup, like it's moved past idea and it's startup, or it's in idea startup, you have a very flat hierarchy. You have your executive committee, which might be your chair, your vice chair, your secretary on your board, your fundraising committee, maybe it's a member, not a committee, right? Maybe it's one person, finance person, membership person, ad hoc person, all on your board, right? And so you may have 5 people and they may all be board members, and that's your organization, and they're all volunteers and they're board and responsible for the day-to-day. And so that's where that yellow line gets tricky. So that's why along kind of that life cycle, if you know where you're at, you can know how to build that capacity. Because at some point in time, your organization is going to need staff members to implement stuff, right? And then there has to be some segregation between what the board does and what the staff does. And in that transition, sometimes you have a little bit of both, right? So here's another nonprofit organizational chart, but all this to say, like, if you've met one nonprofit, you've met one nonprofit. And so your organization may look very different depending upon what it does and how big it is and how many people are involved. And so typically, though, you have a board of directors, again, responsible for the organization. They may hire an executive director, and they may get to the point where they hire an executive director. And it may just be an executive director for a long time. And then they may hire another staff member, and then they may hire another staff member. It may all be volunteers for a long time, but eventually that hierarchy starts growing and filling out based on the needs of the organization and what you're doing. And so I know volunteers is something that's come up quite a bit. Like, how do you, what do you do with volunteers? So volunteers are a tremendous resource for charitable nonprofits. I know you guys are service members, you know, but the organizations, the work that you do is really critical to them because it's the human capital, right? Like it's how they get some of the work done. Volunteers are a tremendous resource. Absent volunteers, many charitable nonprofits would not be able to conduct their programs, raise their funds, or serve their clients. And the vast majority of board members who serve on charitable nonprofit boards are volunteers. And so your board members are volunteers. So that's important to remember as well. Even though they are the key drivers to the organization, they are also volunteering their time, right? They're not paid for their service on the board typically. And so again, you can see Council of Nonprofits has a great resource in terms of volunteers. Where do you go to get volunteers? Churches, civic groups, schools. So like secondary groups like National Honor Society, student councils, post-secondary groups like fraternities, sororities, etc. Like maybe classes in the same field. So like if you're a social service organization, you may go to the social work department head and say, hey, could there be an opportunity for an internship of some kind? AmeriCorps members, I didn't know where to put them, but obviously that's a good place. Businesses, there's some volunteer recruitment platforms. Anyone want to share real quick any other ideas for where they've been successful at finding volunteers for their organization? Again, this isn't a comprehensive list, so.
Social media.
Yep, social media, like recruiting on social media for volunteers, connecting that way.
Depending on the kind of service, like older folks.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. So there are some programs like, I didn't even think about this earlier, Calvin, but thank you. But like there's an RSVP retired service volunteer program, very similar to AmeriCorps, but it's specific to older adults and engaging them. And senior citizen centers may have some individuals who want to get engaged and volunteer in a place. And that's a great place. It's a great idea. Share other ideas in the chat. So do what, Laura?
I'll put it in the chat.
Fantastic. Well, we're running out of time.
Yep.
So I'm like, share in the chat. Okay, so I did want to give you, again, a resource that you could go look at to dive more in. We could probably do a whole day about how to recruit and attract volunteers and maintain them and all that stuff. DonorBox has this, I thought, really comprehensive kind of handbook for how to attract the best volunteers and keep them. And again, there's a whole lot to be said for volunteers, and it's a whole big scheme. But you can look at that resource and see what is volunteer recruitment. How do you attract and recruit the best volunteers? Again, depending upon what you're doing, right? Like, I don't have a great example off the top of my head, but like if you need people, here's a good one. Like if you're Special Olympics, right, and you need people who are physically capable of walking around with athletes and helping them in places, you probably don't want to go to a group of maybe very, very older adults who can't get around very well, that are, are on walkers and canes, right? Like you want to go and find the place where you have the best opportunity to find volunteers and people who are committed to what you're doing. And so volunteer job descriptions are important. That's my one takeaway from this slide. I'll just really tell you, if you have a volunteer, tell them what you want them to do. Because if you just go, we just need help. We just need help. Someone will go, I want to help. I don't know how. And you're just going, we need help. We need help. So if you can really put together a job description or put together tasks, that helps connect your volunteers, right? Because I want to be useful. And so if you need volunteers to whatever, and you have 10 come and 5 stand on the side because you haven't told them what to do, those 5 are never coming back. You have to tell them exactly what you want them to do and see if they'll do it. Hey, will you stand right here and check people in as they walk in? Yes, beautiful, good. Hey, will you put these things in this box for me because this is what needs done? Yes, great. Like just be very specific about what you're asking them to do, and chances are they will do that. Anyways, all that's a part of that. There's a lot in that toolbox, so to speak. I did want to share, if you haven't heard, our Amarillo and Canyon United Way, or United Way of Amarillo and Canyon, has a day of caring. I don't know, Laura, do y'all participate in the day of caring? Connect with you?
We have done the Dumas Day of Caring before as a service day. I don't know that we've done anything specifically on the Amarillo Day.
And that's okay. But what I'm saying is, like, if you have a project that needs done at your organization, go to United Way Amarillo and Canyon and look at the Day of Caring, and you can submit to be one of the projects for the Day of Caring, which is a good way to connect volunteers to you. And let them kind of help use that. They also have a Day of Caring in Hutchinson County, so Borger, and then clearly Dumas, although I didn't find that one, so good to know. So that's one way to maybe get some volunteers or for support for something that you need done. And then has anybody heard of Hands on Amarillo? 2, 3, couple. Okay, if you haven't, here you go. So Hands on Amarillo is you can see right there. Amarillo needs a way to connect volunteers with their favorite organizations, right? That's the thought that she had, and that's the reason that this organization was created. And so it's a website, Hands on Amarillo, and nonprofits put their volunteer opportunities out there, and people who want to volunteer go search for a volunteer opportunity, right? And it's connecting those two things. And so if you're an organization that's not using Hands on Amarillo, that might be a great way to put your volunteer opportunities on and connect with volunteers who may just go, I want to help, but I don't know where. And then when they see, oh, they need placement packages, and I'm really passionate about foster kids and helping in that arena, they can come and be a part of that. Or, oh, I love education. I love the Discovery Center, and I'd love to walk little kids around, to the different spots and volunteer in that way, right? It just helps you connect with people who might be looking to, who are looking to volunteer. And so hopefully they can connect with your organization. Oh yeah. And I wanted to do the little plug for AmeriCorps, right? Because if you're not a partner site, not that this is the right, crowd for that, but it's also a good way to connect with volunteers. Okay, that's what I've got. And I have 1 minute to answer any questions that may.
Take a breath. Woo.
We made it though, guys. We made it. And those resources are all going to be in the slides that are shared. And I think you guys all know, but oops. Oh, I'll do that here in just a second. But if you have a question or you have a thought, you are welcome to reach out to me individually and ask that if this isn't the right kind of place or we don't have time.
And we will make sure these slides go out, because several of you guys, your role is volunteer recruiting, volunteer management. So there were some great links in there. There's some great resources. Also, you can reach out to each other and let us know if you need to connect to other people who are doing volunteer recruitment. We've got some good resources available.
Oh, good question. Good question. I do see a question in the chat. Canyon, so Hands on Amarillo is really Panhandle wide. So Amarillo and Canyon definitely available. And then I'm pretty sure rural communities can use it as well. I don't know how, it depends on how many people are using it to connect, but yeah, it's Panhandle wide.
All right, we're going to wrap this thing up. Reminder, service project tomorrow. We'll be out of the office, but I will be available for a holiday. And we have an exit survey. Hannah, where do we find that exit survey?
That's a great question.
Have Jessica's exit survey, please take it.
Yeah, that one. And then for those who like had to come in late or if somebody who had to leave early, there's a separate survey that they take.
Okay, we'll have like a makeup thing.
Yes.
Survey. We do not have an exit survey just for our AmeriCorps spot today, but take it.
No, it was normally, yeah, I think last time Jessica had another one. And so we had them do that and then just took attendance.
Yep. And on your timesheet, this you use your site, WT AmeriCorps, and then this is training, professional development training. And I know some sites are closed during the break or during the holidays, and that's great. Make sure that your timesheet always has at least 2 hours on it for every timesheet period. So that could be some of those extra hours activities, could be reviewing trainings, checking in on emails. Like there's things you can do, but we can't have a blank timesheet that just says 0 hours for the whole 2 weeks.
Did you say 2 hours per timesheet?
Yes.
I had thought it was 10, and I was really concerned about the second half of December. Thanks. I appreciate that.
2 hours. It may be a great idea to look at your benchmark because it probably requires more than 2. So Isaac, that may be the benchmark
Right.
is still your target.
I think my benchmark might be a little off from where my actual goals need to be because our service site is closed for a whole month. I don't know if that is accounted for.
Well, let's talk separately because that'd be where some of those extra hours in that package that we're going to publish to everybody could come in. Benchmark is still the target. It's like the low bar is 2 hours, and if you fall below that and don't submit an empty timesheet, then we would pursue, hey, are we done with the program? Is it time to, are you leaving AmeriCorps? That's where we need to have some service on every timesheet. But the
I'm sure I'll have more than 2. I was just worried about where I would get those hours with not having classes and whatnot.
right. And that's that package. Yep.
Jessica did send a second survey in the chat. So
Great. Okay. So,
Only got 15 responses, so.
all right, y'all, do your surveys.
I think I got everyone who requested to be added into the Teams chat. If you need some time to think it over, if you get FOMO later on, you could also message me or just AmeriCorps@wtamu.edu via email. And we can get you in there. Somebody messaged me asking to be added, but their username doesn't show who the member is. So if you're iPhone 4, please share your staff email and I could get you in there.